So we have reached the end, and we're ending with a bang, reached the end of our 2021 speaker series, the speaker series that began digital and is ending digital. We'll be considering what the future holds as we plan for our 2022 speaker series and perhaps a return to some in-person events. We've had a great lineup, and I think that having Dr. Janine Jones anchor our speaker series with this talk today surrounding culturally responsive school mental health interventions is a fantastic way to conclude. This speaker series is made possible because of a grant from the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences that allows us at the SMART Center to bring in a fantastic group of postdoctoral fellows. The principal investigator on that is Eric Bruns, one of the associate directors of the SMART Center. And it's through that grant and support from the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center that we are here with you today. I also want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The SMART Center acknowledges that we live, learn, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. And we are grateful to aim to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. So a little bit about the SMART Center. I'm Aaron Lyon, one of the co-directors of the SMART Center, and I have the pleasure of telling you a little bit about what we're all about if you haven't been to one of our sessions before. And the SMART Center, which we really conceptualize as an implementation research and technical assistance center co-located in the University of Washington School of Medicine and College of Education, it's really oriented toward promoting high quality, culturally responsive programming to meet the needs of the full social, emotional, behavioral needs of all students through research, training, technical assistance, and support to policymaking. We really are oriented toward two primary gaps at the SMART Center. The first is the access and utilization of services, knowing that the most effective intervention possible isn't going to be worth much if it's not accessible to a large population of students and families in need. And then enhancing service quality, recognizing that without high quality services, even the most accessible care can fall short. And we recognize that these are complementary and interconnected. And our pursuit of increasing the accessibility and effectiveness and impact overall of schools and school-based mental health services that can support the mission of schools requires simultaneous attention to both of these. So the SMART Center goes about this in a number of different ways. A lot of it is through our research, training or technical assistance, and policy work, which are of course interconnected. This includes basic research on school mental health, whether we're identifying and developing contextually sort of appropriate interventions, streamlined interventions, well-designed interventions that can fit the school context well, or developing and testing models that work both related to interventions and implementation approaches, that sort of training and technical assistance collection of strategies. And we build on that and mobilize our evidence by both providing direct research-based training and technical assistance to districts and counties and sometimes statewide, as well as conducting explicit research on implementation and technical assistance strategies that are meant to move the needle on the rates of adoption and sustained use of effective and contextually appropriate programs. And we also have what we refer to often as Policy Core, which aims to disseminate information broadly and also be at the table, build political will, and support by providing expertise and knowledge, information to funders and policymakers, and serving as a resource to the extent that we can surrounding critical decision-making that can have broad population-level impacts. I also want to introduce you to our UW SMART Center postdoctoral fellows who are part of why we're able to do all of this. We were able to receive a grant from the Institute of Education Sciences, as I noted earlier, to support this, and it also has allowed us to bring in a fantastic group of postdoctoral fellows. Currently, our fellows are Stephanie Brewer, Kathy Corbin, Maria Hugh, and Courtney Zuloff-McCurdy. And you can learn more about our entire Smart Center team at our Smart Center website. So you can find more information about our research projects, and our schedule for sessions such as this at our Smart Center website. And you may also follow us on Twitter if you are so inclined. I, for one, will be tweeting at least once or twice during Janine's talk. Also want to acknowledge the contributions of and criticality of our Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center school mental health team, which includes Kelsey Schmitz, Megan Lucy, Natalie Flores, and Eric Bruns. And this is part of our opportunity with funding from SAMHSA to provide direct training and technical assistance toward the implementation of effective programming and supporting the development of school-based mental health service systems on a large scale. So now it is my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Janine Jones. I think we have a record number of registrants for our Smart Center speaker series for this talk. And I think it's easy to recognize why. It is such an honor to be able to introduce my colleague, Dr. Janine Jones. She's been at the Smart Center and affiliated with the Smart Center in one form or another since before there was a Smart Center. She was actually originally part of the original grant from the Institute of Education Sciences that was not a center grant, but was a research grant that first allowed us to kind of solidify our partnership between those of us in the Department of Psychiatry and colleagues at the College of Education. We've been building on that ever since. Dr. Jones is a professor of school psychology in the University of Washington's College of Education, where she also serves as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, because I guess she didn't have enough going on. And she's a licensed psychologist and nationally certified school psychologist. Her research and scholarly work focuses on the critical topics of multiculturalism, culturally responsive interventions, and building resilience, school engagement, and sense of belonging among children and adolescents of color. She's the author of numerous articles and books on these topics, which push the envelope surrounding the design and delivery of culturally responsive interventions and intervention adaptations in schools. She's received a range of awards, such as being invited to deliver the National Association of School Psychologists' 50th Anniversary Distinguished Lecture in 2019. And more than all of this, Janine Jones is a deeply thoughtful colleague, a deliberate and innovative scholar, and just a fantastic human being who makes every project or meeting she's part of better while somehow navigating all these different clinical, research, administrative, and teaching hats that she wears. And finally, one thing that most people who work with Janine likely know is how much of a technophile she is. And I thought I was relatively up to date on new digital innovations and technologies, but I have lost count of the number of cool and useful technologies that I have learned about directly from Janine. And I have to imagine that in this year of unprecedented digital and virtual work, that she probably fared better than most, navigating her way through the digital ether. So please welcome me in, join me in welcoming Dr. Janine Jones.
Thank you, Aaron. That was the sweetest introduction. I love it. Oh my gosh, that very, very generous. I am so happy to be here. I am so grateful that you have taken your time on this Wednesday in June. It has been a year to be had, and I just appreciate your interest in what I have to say and this topic I feel really passionate about. And it's something that I've been talking about for some time. And part of this is just my desire to make sure that all children and families are served well. And so what I want to do today is really talk about ways in which we do culturally responsive school mental health interventions and speak from the lens of how do we adapt evidence-based approaches to treatment. And so I feel like Aaron's really generous when he talks about my technology skills, because one skill I don't have very well is Twitter. Aaron's the expert. I follow him. I try and learn from him because he's pretty good. So follow him. But I do have my Twitter on there too, just because I'm finding my way. All right. So let me go ahead and get started. So as I start, I want to start with a few terminologies because I use a lot of terms, and I think some of it has to do with over the years, I use different phrases, and I just want to tell you kind of what I mean when I'm saying them. So when I say culturally responsive practices, every term that you use, people have a critique. They have something to say about why it doesn't work in certain contexts. I'm going to tell you why I say them, and then just know what I mean. So when I say culturally responsive practices, I mean that I am attending to, listening to, paying attention to the cultural needs of a particular child or family, and I'm responding to those needs. So I am cueing in, I am listening, I am respecting. That's what culturally responsive means to me. Culturally and linguistically diverse, or CLD. I don't tend to use that as much, but that is a term that I will use to refer to a population of people. Particularly, I'll lean there when I'm referring to linguistically diverse people. So people that are bilingual or multilingual, and trying to respect and honor the linguistic context. You'll hear me refer to people as BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And this is probably in the past 4 or 5 years a term that has been used more. The reason why I'm leaning more into BIPOC to reference a group of people at times is because I really appreciate how BIPOC centers Black people in ways that other terminologies do not. So Black and Indigenous purposefully are identified separately from people of color, but more often you'll hear me say people of color or POCs. Racialized and minoritized, this is a way of referring to people of color who are oppressed or being oppressed upon. And so this is a way of talking about the experience of people of color. So racialized or minoritized. So if you hear me referring to using those terms, that's what I mean. Bias, you probably already know what I mean by that. And bias is just the ways in which we think that are shaped by our own experiences. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then finally, evidence-based intervention. So you'll hear the term evidence-based treatments. I may say that. School mental health interventions, counseling, therapy, evidence-based interventions, all I'm really referring to the therapeutic processes that we provide to support the social-emotional needs of youth, and typically in school settings is what I'm referring to. The context may vary, but the approaches are relatively the same. So when I'm talking about practices today, I'm talking about adapting those particular practices in those settings. You also hear me say, I'm probably going to say client, depending upon the populations that I'm talking to. Sometimes I'll say client, sometimes I'll say student, sometimes I'll say patient. Translate that to your context. So whichever ways you refer to the people that you serve, I'll probably say client today to be as inclusive as possible. But it's really the terminology that you use in your setting. So speaking of bias, I just said you probably knew what I mean by bias. I will just identify that my core bias when it comes to interventions and treatment is that culture is the primary lens that a person views the world. That's what I believe. And I believe that cultural factors are the foundation for treatment interventions. So I honestly don't believe that we can do authentic treatment for people without taking into account their culture. So if we think about what my lens might look like, I pay attention to emotions, and I say it in the same way that you do, that how we feel and how our emotions kind of drive our behaviors. I think about our thoughts, what we believe, and how our beliefs affect our emotions. And I think about how the complex interactions that happen when we are dealing with other people. In terms of behaviors, I think about why we act in the way we do and how we respond in our interactions with one another. And then in our interventions, I think about what we do to solve problems. All of it, I think, in the cultural context is really the lens at which I view the world. And it really makes all of this work personal because I care deeply about what do they bring to the situation that I am trying to develop interventions and make interpretations about their emotions, their thoughts, and their behaviors. But it all has to be done within context because they're spending a very small amount of time with me in the context of everything else that they're living and doing. By doing this approach and by thinking in this way, it allows for within group variation because we do have to have an understanding of a general cultural context for most people, particularly those from oppressed groups. But if we don't think about that there is variation within groups, we don't really do a good job of serving individuals. And so I think pretty deeply about the within group variation within the cultural context. And I also care deeply about resilience and the ways in which we achieve positive outcomes despite barriers and challenging circumstances. So part of the ways that I'll talk to you about doing the adaptations today will be to put all of this in perspective. So let me start here. So I'm going to do three things. I'll talk about why we need to do cultural adaptations, and then I'll talk briefly about what models exist for doing it, and then how we do it. And when I talk about how, I'll just give you some examples of things that you want to pay attention to on how we will do or should do cultural adaptations. But I should start with a little bit of truth that in my 20 plus years, I have experienced a lot of psychologists and researchers that don't really see the value in doing cultural adaptations and actively resisting and feeling not convinced that there is any need to integrate culture and diversity in the treatment. And in doing so, they have argued, you'll find plenty of articles that argue that doing cultural adaptations invalidate treatment when it comes to evidence-based treatment. And for me, I find it bothersome because a person can just say, they don't have to prove that it invalidates treatment. They can just say they don't have to say it makes things worse. They don't have to say that it invalidates. They just say that it does. But from my perspective, nobody has to really prove that it's working for people of color in particular. So I'm coming from the perspective of you can do adaptations to add and enhance treatments to address the cultural needs of people, and it just makes them more effective. So I'm really not saying you have to fully change it. I'm saying you add and enhance, and that will make them even better for particular populations. All right, so why? There are some historical perspectives from minoritized individuals that have affected mental health treatment and stigma. And so I'm just going to briefly go through a couple of them. So the history of mental health treatment is really paternalistic, that mostly white men have developed the theories that we have when it comes to developing our theoretical models of treatment, and not really engaged in what it means to the origins of treatment and what it means to serve people of color, particularly those that have been oppressed for generations. So if it wasn't developed for a particular group of people, it's really hard to adapt without understanding how to integrate those perspectives. As many are trained in a model that treatment is a focus on, I'm the expert and I'll fix the problem. I kind of come in and I have the answers. There are some that still work in that way, not all, but some that do. And for families that are new to being able to seek out treatment, they may experience that kind of perspective when they come in, and it doesn't feel like a safe place to be. High socioeconomic status is kind of typical. So if you've ever looked for a referral or asked for a referral, oftentimes you'll be looking for or have to look for people that accept insurance, or you find that options are quite limited if you don't have insurance. So just recognizing the history of mental health treatment is really for people that have much higher incomes and have access to a lot more resources if they are not seeking services in a school setting. Individualistic for, I'll talk about more collectivistic cultures, but the approach to treatment is designed to be individualistic. It's one-on-one. It's for one person to learn a skill and implement that skill and do that in isolation and see it as their own perspective and their own growth. And that's not typical of many communities of color on the ways that they think and operate in the world. Also, mental health treatment is historically overly reliant on the clinician expertise and their skill level to be successful, and less so on the client and what they bring. And then there's the lovely savior complex, where many clinicians feel the ability to come in and help somebody is really their ultimate achievement. And it is their achievement when somebody succeeds rather than the client's growth and their own opportunity. And that doesn't feel good to a client to be on the other end of that. So the stigma piece is also tied into those historical perspectives, that there's clinical research that has harmed communities of color that you may have even heard about in the past year when we started talking about the vaccines for the coronavirus, that there was vaccine hesitancy because of in the Black community in particular, because of the Tuskegee experimentation that happened years ago. Or you may have heard about the Henrietta Lacks research that occurred where her cells were used in cancer research without her permission. And so when knowing about many examples of the ways that experimentation was done on people, especially Black people, because they were dehumanized, you might see why there might be suspiciousness or distrust among health professionals. Therapy also it operates in a deficit model, and it's not really strength-based, and that doesn't feel so good for people that already feel like society perceives them in a deficit. People that have experiences with bias in many different contexts, that therapy, you don't want to go into a therapeutic context and already know that bias is going to shape the ways in which you receive treatment. So you try to avoid that. Others, there's a stigma attached because of that hierarchy in therapy, where it kind of simulates that same oppression that's experienced in life, where there's a hierarchy of this expert that has all of the power, and do you come in a vulnerable state? So there's avoidance. There's a natural avoidance unless you can do something to kind of reduce that hierarchy. And so, and when I was in practice I was in private practice for 14 years. And during that time, one of the first questions I asked a lot of families is, how did you find me? And what made you come to me? And in the beginning, many were saying, it's because you're a Black woman. I felt like there was things I wouldn't have to explain by coming to you. And that was true, because there were lots of things that they wouldn't have had to explain to me. There were lots of things that they did have to explain, but just that piece reduced stigma, even though it was not necessary for me to be a matched ethnically clinician for them, because I can do the same practices as others, but they would not have to worry about this stigma piece at the beginning. So that leads to the next point there, that the bias of clinicians who have no awareness of cultural factors of other populations besides their own can influence how well the treatment will go. And then there's this complicated element of culture. It's really hard to operationalize, and you really have to pay attention to how does it affect the bias in therapy. If you don't have a real awareness of how culture fits in, you have to know that if you're missing it or if you're not including it in part of the process, there's attrition issues. You may have no-shows. You may have late to session, get increasingly late. There may be a lack of trust in the cross-cultural kind of counseling relationship that lasts for a long time, hard to build a rapport. There may be a natural disconnect, or there may be a rupture that occurs where there's a natural relationship in toward the beginning, and then there's a rupture that occurs that cannot be restored. And then just know that for many BIPOC people in particular, explaining is absolutely exhausting. And so finding that balance of giving the opportunity for voice and having to explain, giving that balance and the opportunity at the same time of respecting that it's really, really hard to be in all spaces, and having to explain the experience over and over again is really tough. So with all of that, what do cultural adaptations do? I mean, there's great benefits to doing cultural adaptations. The benefits to treatment are it really helps the cultural compatibility. It also has ecological validity, because part of doing this, it builds out the opportunity for the work that you're doing in session to expand and have an impact outside of session. It's more likely to take outside, and they're more likely to connect in their ecological environment. It allows the clinician more opportunities for addressing the unique needs of the client. So remember, I was talking about within group variation a while ago. It gives you the space and the opportunity to really pay attention to those unique needs, not only the cultural context for the whole, or for predominantly for a particular group of people, but also for that individual. It also benefits the client by helping them have their subjective experience really identified. And it ties in or cues in their values. It pulls in their individual coping mechanisms. It helps them have a place to talk about their experiences with discrimination, which is often the only place that they have is with their family or close friends or people that share those experiences. To have it in a therapeutic context is incredibly powerful. It also increases treatment acceptability, because it makes the clinician even more a positive authority, because they recognize that they understand and respect the whole person. It gives a real honor of what their life experience is. And then it increases generalizability beyond the session, like I was describing on the treatment having more ecological validity. And then for benefiting the clinician, it really helps show the cultural competence of the clinician and enhances rapport even more quickly by doing this. So in general, what should we be doing? Give you kind of big categories here. We should be designing our interventions within the cultural context. We should be employing intervention procedures that are appropriate for the target group that we're working with. We should address within group variation, and we should attend to acculturation before making interpretations. I promise I'll talk about acculturation, because that is when I see people's eyes cross. So let me talk about models of cultural adaptation. So what goes into making these treatment adaptations? There are lots of models out there. They've been around a long time, but I'm going to use one to kind of guide us today. But here's just 4. So they all have acronyms, none of which I remember very well. So I've just got them up here. I'll leave it up for just a moment. The model for effective deployment and translation of science into practice, MED-TSP, is one. The stage model of behavioral therapies, SMBT. Formative method for adapting psychotherapy, FMAP or FMAP, and ecological validity and cultural sensitivity framework, the EVCSV. So I can't even say the acronym, I get tongue tied, but the one that I'm going to tie into is the ECCSV model today. So what I ended up saying is the Bernal Bonilla Bellido model. That's what I end up saying most of the time. It's a mouthful, but when you see the components of this last framework, it's much more simple and it'll make a lot of sense. But these models, most of them, what they do is they give you kind of domains to adjust or think about when you're doing cultural adaptation, so that you can anchor your work around what are the ways that I need to be paying attention to culture as I'm doing this evidence-based approach to treatment. Notice I'm not saying change your evidence-based approach to treatment. I am saying, what do I need to be cueing into as I'm doing this evidence-based treatment? So let's take a peek at the Bernal model. Here are the domains within the model. So language, paying attention to, is the language that you are implementing your intervention in appropriate and culturally syntonic with the person that you're working with. Person is the role of ethnic similarities and differences between you as the clinician and the client shaping your treatment. What is the person, the elements of the person that you are attending to? So if you work from a psychodynamic perspective, you would be paying attention to things like transference and countertransference. That's the kind of things you'd be paying attention to for person. Content, the cultural knowledge of the clinician. Do you have a sense of the content you should be paying attention to for that cultural or racial group? Concepts, the treatment concepts, are they consistent with the culture of the client and the context that they're living in? Goals, the goals of treatment, are they in support or supportive or positive and adaptive cultural values and not imposing new values? The methods that you're doing in treatment, are they enhancing methods? Are they culturally enhancing methods? And then context, you want to consider the sociocultural and the economic context of the client. Not so bad. All of these principles are things that you think about when you're doing evidence-based work. You just might not be contextualizing your evidence-based approaches with these things in mind. This is just a way to kind of help you draw them forward and help you contextualize it for the client that you're working with. So now what I'm going to do is walk you through some of these, almost all of these domains with particular strategies that you can do. So strategies. How do we adapt treatments to be culturally responsive? So Bernal model is the one. Now I can't remember the acronym. ECVCSF. EVCSF. Never mind. All right. Oh, I have it. Yay. I forgot I put it up there. EVCSF. I did have it. Okay. Person. Recognize cross-cultural differences. That's the way that I remember it. So here's some things to think about when you want to recognize cross-cultural differences. So watch this. As you watched that video, what did you think? What was happening? Car thief or lost keys? We interpret this event based on our experiences. We had very limited information. We had no sound, we had no context. We were just observers. So what we did in that moment, we aligned with what was familiar. With limited information, what we usually do is we perceive the situation negatively. That's usually what we do. Because if we can't identify with the other person or the other situation, it doesn't make sense to us. So what we do is we fill in the gaps. We make these shortcuts. So in a millisecond, you were watching and you're picking up on there's something happening here. I picked up on some things. First time I watched it, I thought lost keys. And the reason why I did is because before we had fobs for our cars, I many times locked my keys in the car and had the experience of going back again and again and again, looking in the same place, hoping that my keys would magically appear on the seat that I've already looked at 3, 4, and 5 times. So I could identify with this guy thinking, he's come back again and he's looking for these darn keys. But if you have never had that experience, or if you have been watching the media and repeatedly seen Black men perceived as criminals or Black men perceived as threats, you might have seen a car thief in that moment. What happened then was we made culturally based assumptions in that millisecond that was a shortcut. Our brain created a shortcut to manage that complex information that we just received. We were hardwired to fill in the blanks. That right there is implicit bias. That's what that is. So If you thought he was a car thief, don't feel bad. Do not feel bad, because our society has primed you for that. Our society has primed you to think in that way if you are not a Black male yourself, and if you have been watching over and over the ways that Black men have been portrayed. And so what you have to do is fight that. If your brain, remember I said it happens in a millisecond, you can't necessarily stop your brain from doing that. So if your brain does that, you have to fight against it by intentionally filling in the blanks, by seeking additional information before acting. So you can have the thought, make the interpretation, freeze for a moment and think, and then gather more information before you act, before you make a judgment, before you say anything. That, as part of person, is to do our best to try and make decisions and judgments about the people that we work with in a way that is not impacted by implicit bias as much as it could be. That's all that I ask, is do your best to disrupt those patterns. Another thing that you can do is pay attention to communication style differences when you're paying attention to person. And so I like using this chart. It's from a pretty old version of a text that's now, I think it's in its 8th edition. But I like this table because it identifies, I removed the names of the ethnic groups from the top because I don't think that's important. What I do think is important is looking at the variability across these different communication styles. So looking on the left side, you can see speaking style and the way eye contact is used to communicate, the patterns of speaking, the response speed, and the intensity. And then looking down columns, you can see the variability. You can see going from culture A, you can see that there's more soft and slower speech, whereas culture E is more animated with affect and lots of emotion. And then the eye contact, you can see more of an indirect gaze when listening, all the way over to direct eye contact and prolonged when speaking, but less when listening. And then speech, delayed speech, more silence and honoring silence, whereas quicker responses is expected in other communication styles. So as you're thinking about that, kind of position yourself. You might see yourself in multiple columns even. I can see myself in multiple columns because I was raised one way. And then in being trained to be a psychologist, I had to unlearn a whole lot of things. And so in practice, when I'm serving people, I behave in one way or communicate in one way. But then when I'm with elders in my community, I communicate in another way. And then when I'm with my family and I'm a parent, then I'm communicating in another way. So I actually shift my communication style depending upon my positionality in situations. So think about you and how you interact, and then think about your professional self and the ways in which you communicate. And then think about what you think it means if somebody communicates differently than you, especially if it is the polar opposite of the way that you communicate. That can influence the ways in which you relate to somebody in a therapeutic relationship. You might interpret silence as disengagement. You might interpret silence as rude. You might interrupt when somebody's actually needing that space to process information. You might fill in for people when they really need that time to be respectful. So kind of think about that as you are relating to one another, and recognize that these differences are very key to every aspect of the work that we're doing, every interaction that you have with people. So I'll give one more example of person. So here are two different contexts. So context A, when a person is in relationship with one other, respect takes priority. So a status of a person is the utmost importance. The person has to be known really well to be understood. Knowing the history is really important. And then interdependence is core to relationships, meaning relying on one another, being an interconnected part of the community is critical. And then in context B, a person has to be direct. to be understood. So being heard takes priority. And those communication rules, they kind of need to be consistent in a similar way in all settings. And then one should look to the future to find solutions. And then independence is really what leads to success. So you kind of see these two contexts. One is much more independent and more individualistic. The other is much more collectivistic. And another way to describe them is high context and low context, that there's low levels of interpretation that are needed that happen in low context, whereas in high context, there's a whole lot of subjective things that have to be understood. There's a lot of subtle nuances that have to be paid attention to really understand a person. You got a lot of questions that you have to ask to get a sense of what a person needs. So I'm overlaying collectivistic cultures with context A and individualistic cultures with context B. You kind of have to know where you fall. If you're in between, if you fall in one, if the person that you're serving with falls in the other, you have to know where you need to be more sensitive and pay attention to your own style and how much you have to step out of your own worldview to be able to understand your client. I am looking at my time. I got to move a little faster. All righty. So method, here's another part of the model. Alter your approach to start with a good sociocultural history. And I'm going to show you a tool that you have in your PDFs. So you can see this, a full page of these. But these are questions that I developed years ago and asked a woman named Pamela Hayes, who has something called the addressing framework, if I could anchor my questions off of her framework. And it's pretty much another acronym called addressing, and it's categories of things that you can think about when you're trying to think about cultural influences on treatment. And so on the left, you'll see each of the categories of addressing. And then on the right are questions that I asked over the years. I just found that these were things that I ask every client as part of my sociocultural history development in treatment. And these are direct questions to get at each one of these domains as part of an understanding of who people were. And what I found was, in training, working with students, that many, what we were doing was we were teaching these kind of structured or semi-structured clinical interviews with these standard questions, and none of them were really culturally derived. And so I started anchoring these on top of that to help them get at basic questions as well as cultural context kind of questions. And so I invite you to read through these, think about these, and then look at which questions make you uncomfortable, because there are some that I found that students over the years felt really resistant and uncomfortable asking. And I would push and ask why. What makes you afraid to ask these questions? And I'll tell you the answer before you even ask it yourself. And that is that these are questions around topics that have been perceived as taboo. But I will tell you, they are not taboo for people of color. These are topics that they talk about and experience every single day. So you, as a clinician, if you open up the space to talk about things that are racially related or part of their experiences of oppression or related to bias, you are showing your cultural competence. You are showing your ability to respect and honor the actual silent struggles of BIPOC people. So pay attention to the questions and pay attention to why you're not comfortable and practice asking them until you're comfortable, because they will open up a world of knowledge and relationality that you will have probably not experienced before in a cross-cultural counseling situation. So this is the first page, and here's the second page with the remaining categories. And then on the bottom are three articles that you can read that applied the GEMAS framework that help you kind of see how it was used in counseling study, as well as in just in general in the context of models of research. Content. So you want to know the culture, or at least the basics about the culture. And so I'm going to hit some categories here, and then I'll talk about acculturation, because I know that was the one I said. That's where people's eyes cross when I say you want to attend to acculturation. So one, you want to collect data in general domains of knowledge. And so I gave you those GEMIS questions. They're all questions that will get you at a bunch of these categories. So I'm loading them up quickly here. You want to have a sense of the values, perceptions, and beliefs of your client. These take time to get. You're not going to get this in a one interview session, but you can ask and give space by asking really open-ended questions, and ask the ones that ask about elders, ask about histories, tell me a story. Those get you at a lot of that first category. You want to have a sense of strengths and supports. Who, how, you want to know what really makes them feel good, what makes them feel successful, how have they pushed through, what has been successful coping mechanisms. I'm starting with those because what draws people into treatment are the problems. What draws people in to receiving or seeking services from us are deficits and things that aren't working. And so if we start with strengths, it gives us something to anchor off of. So start with those, find out what those supports are and the categories of supports. You want to know about acculturation and the context at which they're living in, and I'll walk through that in a moment. You want to know the environment and what are the environmental supports and the things that are working and that they need. And then you want to have a sense of adverse childhood experiences that they're experiencing or have experienced in the past. But on top of that, you want to know adverse childhood experiences that are community-based, including racism and discrimination for BIPOC youth in particular, because those are every day, every moment, constant that we miss, that we haven't really considered. And if you have not, they haven't been going into contexts where people have given them the space to really process and work through those, you're not going to get very far in your treatment if it's a core aspect of what they're dealing with every day. So acculturation, I am borrowing from John Barry's model of acculturation because I find that it is probably the easiest to understand when we think about acculturation. I like to use this model because he has it anchored in 4 domains. Quadrants is the way that it was originally defined. I don't like defining it that way. The reason why I have arrows is because I think that it makes more sense to think as a continuum. But the 4 categories are assimilation, individualism, separation, and integration. And along the horizontal axis, if you think about it as an axis, that's the ways in which or whether a person prefers learning and adopting a new culture. And then the vertical is whether a person prefers keeping their native heritage, culture, and identity. And so when a person is giving up their native heritage and identity and adopting a new culture, that is assimilation. Now, you may have heard the term assimilation and acculturation used interchangeably. They are not the same thing. So acculturation is the concept, it's an overarching concept where a person is, or the process in which by which a person changes when they're influenced by contact with another culture. That's the process. And assimilation is one strategy or one approach. So it's giving up your heritage to adopt a new culture and fit in. Whereas going up to the upper right, separation is one where a person maintains or holds on to their native heritage and identity and gives up or does not or chooses not to adopt a new culture. So they really hold on regardless of the context that they're in. Integration is where they can do a little bit of both and they adopt their new culture as well as maintain their native heritage. And you see a lot of what we refer to as code switching, where it's being flexible and moving back and forth between cultural contexts. And then individualism is someone that's going to kind of describe themselves as an individual, and they're not going to align with any particular group, and they will keep defining themselves in that way. And so if you think in terms of these kind of 4 categories, it kind of helps you think about how do I do my treatment and how do I pay attention to the needs of the client. So I'm going to take this and think about our interventions and how much adaptation you need to do. And so you've got this slide, so I'll move quickly through this, that you have to do much more or have a lot more cultural competence and cultural training when it comes to integration and when it comes to separation. Because when a person is holding on to their native heritage more than anything, they're going to be testing you. As a clinician, they're going to be testing what you know. They're going to be testing to see if you can even work with them, because you have to understand their cultural context. They may not even come to you if you do not align with their own racial identity. For somebody who's assimilating, moderate adaptations are important because you have to know what they're giving up. That's important too, because there's Barry's research showed that a person that is using assimilation strategy of acculturation experiences the most acculturation stress because they're having to give up a part of themselves. The marginalization or individualism is what he shifted to in 2005. That is low. You really can't really have a whole lot of training and cultural competence because everything is so individualized. But integration, it's still moderate to high because you really have to be flexible and really move with your particular client. So knowing those kind of domains or the different strategies, recognizing that it's along a continuum, that you have to be as flexible as and fluid as your clients are. How to get a sense of content, you can use things like, here's a tool for, it's called the AHIMSA, the Attitudes, Habits, and Interests Multicultural Scale for Adolescents. It's not really a scale. It's basically a sentence completion. And all it is trying to get at, it's giving you sentence stems to get a sense of what is the acculturation of that adolescent. Just asking questions or having them complete the sentence to help you learn a little bit more about them. And so I have the citation there if you want to pull that up. But really, you can see this, questions from the GIMIS, all of those help you gather information around the ways in which a person copes, what matters most to them, what are the things that really help them along when it comes to coping with everyday stressors. Context. Pay attention to the social and ecological context that they live in. So when you're trying to understand people who experience racial oppression, there's key concepts that you need to know. So one is implicit bias. So think about that car video that I showed. Microaggressions, you heard lots and lots about microaggressions. And then I probably won't show it, but I have a little video clip that I'll just tell you where to find it, that just shows adolescents that are talking about what microaggressions are. And then a concept called stereotype threat that I'll quickly explain to you. And that is where a youth is fearful that they are going to confirm a stereotype. So basically where a person, there's stereotypes that exist, a child or adolescent knows about the stereotype and they are fearful that they're going to confirm it. And so what they do is they will respond by either behaving in the opposite way to avoid that confirming that stereotype, or some will just give in and they will just do the behavior, and they will do the behavior because they just feel helpless to it. And then there's a concept called attributional ambiguity that I'll explain in just a little bit. But the video, I'll just show you the beginning so you can find it on YouTube. Okay, Hatch workshop microaggressions.
Oh, you're so pretty for a Black girl. Oh, she has a Jew nose. Oh, your hair would look so good if it was straight. Jews are so cheap. Why are you so cheap?
Do you speak good English?
How are you an Iraqi Jew?
I think the person saying microaggression kind of doesn't really think about it.
This person who said it was my
Never
friend.
mind,
And,
I'm
I was
showing
just
it.
honest. They would say something like that.
You don't want to make a big deal about it, but then it's also like, you just said something that offended me, so I feel like I should speak up.
Because they're micro, because They're very subtle. They're small. You feel like you don't have a reason to be upset. You're overreacting, and people even can make you feel that way when you bring it up.
They're like, oh, you can't take a joke. You're making too big of a deal of this. Why are you overreacting?
Don't take it so seriously. It was just a joke. Chill out.
Say like, oh no, I actually love Black people. I love people of color. Like, they try to just minimize the situation. If someone feels hurt by a microaggression, it shouldn't just be pushed to the side. It definitely has negative impacts and like leads to people disliking who they actually are.
Those kinds of subtle offensive comments can build up over time, and they can have like a deep psychological effect, and they can make you feel bad, and they can make you doubt yourself.
We try to just use jokes to like make things less awkward or like ease social experiences. But it is important because you need to like be aware of what you're saying and like who you're speaking to.
Think of what you say and how it can affect the person you're saying it to.
Okay, I tried to do that as a teaser, but they say it so so much better than I can. So I just love that video because these are young little people saying something that is so powerful. They're describing that microaggressions are these brief everyday exchanges, and they're these denigrating messages that people are saying because of what they see, and not based on, and they're usually based in stereotypes about a group membership, and they're really subtle insults, and they're based on the surface, and that's it. And they, I hope you saw the frequency. That study was years ago, and it was describing 291 microaggressions within a 90-day period, like that frequent. And these are young people, and so imagine adults, it's even probably even more. So keep in mind their faces as you think about these are happening and part of their everyday lives as they're dealing with life. And so I would like to show that video, and then I'd like to show this picture, because after you see it and you think about everything that you say, things slip out, and it makes us scared to even say anything. And so I love this whole face, because it's like, oh my gosh, should I, can I? But you still have to see what I was saying earlier about implicit bias. It's like sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we say things that we shouldn't say. Sometimes we think things that we shouldn't think or that are wrong. All I ask is to just fix it, go back and come, when somebody says a microaggression to me, sometimes my face shows it. And the people that I respect the most are the ones that circle back and come back to me and say, I saw your face. I didn't catch it until an hour later, and I wanted to come back to talk to you about it. And I'm like, I love that. I appreciate that. I've done the same thing. If I've committed a microaggression, I will circle back to a person, especially if I know them and I care about them and I care about the relationship. Feel like it's the right and okay thing to do in therapeutic relationships as well as in personal relationships. So this one, I made this years ago to just kind of show like the connection in a classroom of what stereotype threat and microaggressions look like. So here we've got a young lady that comes into her classroom, and the teacher says, you should be on time, Tanisha. You need all the time we have to learn. And Tanisha thinks in her head, I bet he thinks all Black people are always late. So what she's in her head, the first thing she's thinking about is the stereotype of being late. But as she starts walking to her seat, she might have also picked up on something else. You need all the time we have to learn. And that sounds like a microaggression associated with the stereotype about intellect, about Black people. So as she gets to her seat, if she starts perseverating on that, then she's going to be sitting there spending time going, oh my gosh, not only does he think all Black people are late, but then I'm also not smart enough to get the material, and he just pointed it out in front of everybody. So everybody's going to think I'm stupid. So I'm not going to be able to learn this now. Why? I might as well just leave. So you think about how her brain was working. That is not a learning context. There's no way she's going to be able to connect with the material at that point. So Think about if you were the person serving Tanisha in that classroom, if you don't create a context for her to be able to talk about experiences like that, you would never know that that's what she's dealing with every day. Mei Lee, will you explain the concept to the class? I'm sure you understand. And Mei Lee is sitting there and says, I'd better pretend like I get it and be the smart Asian he expects. And she's sitting in the front desk there. And Mei Lee is tapping into a whole nother concept called the model minority myth, where she's an Asian American and she doesn't understand what he's talking about, but she is dealing with the stereotype that she's supposedly going to understand. That's damaging too. That's not a positive stereotype. That's damaging because then there's performance anxiety associated with that, particularly if she doesn't understand. And then there's the youngster in the back. This is, now I bet he thinks all black. Oh, not that one. I'm sorry. Why pay attention? He put me in the back here for a reason. Teacher didn't even say anything, but they're interpreting based on their experience. So kind of think about, these are things that are all happening in their heads. If we aren't creating a context for them to talk about, recognize, understand that we know that these might be their experiences, we're missing something. That's what I want to point to. So that last concept of attributional ambiguity that I mentioned a few slides ago, that is that moment that I was describing with Tanisha, where she's sitting there wondering and she's questioning, did he say that because he thinks I'm not smart? Did he say that because I'm Black? Is he tying into the fact that Black people are late? That whole process is mentally taxing. It is the wondering, the questioning, the feeling around, is it me or is it my people? Is it about us? Is it something I can or cannot control? That's taxing. All right, so I just, as I describe all of this, these are some behaviors that are associated with trauma and long-term stress, especially racialized trauma. School avoidance, irritability, hypervigilance, like feeling on guard, anxiety, pessimism, feeling withdrawn, being clingy, numbing or an apathy, and aggression. Think about all of the referrals that you get. Some of these are internalized, some are externalized behaviors, but think about the consequences for some of the externalized behaviors and what we do when we see these behaviors. Do we go to therapy? Do we tend to go to interventions that pay attention to things such as racialized oppression? No, we don't. We tend to deal with the behavior and that's it. And we don't go to what's the internalized experience that might underlie the behavior. That's what I'm asking you to do when you're doing these culturally responsive interventions. All right. So I know I've got, I'm sorry of the time, 3 minutes. So you can read these slides. I will not talk too much on these next couple. So your goals, you want to make them positive, value-oriented, and strength-based. Here are some ideas for culturally related personal strengths that you can look for, because I often get people asking, well, what kind of strengths should we pay attention to? So here's some ideas. So you can see deep connections to the land and elements, culturally related knowledge, ability to code switch, flexibility, balancing group loyalty and personal autonomy. All of these are great personal strengths that require a lot of internal fortitude. Know that when a person has high positive racial identity, that it leads to these great outcomes: higher academic engagement, great emotion, higher self-esteem, better graduation rates, reduced teen pregnancy, buffering from oppression, all that. These are interpersonal cultural supports that you want to lean into or look at. So remember, I mentioned you want to know what strengths are. You want to know what some of these supports are. So here's things to pay attention to. So like, do they have access to elders and guidance for insight? Do they have access to storytelling activities to make meaning and pass on the history of a particular group? Do they have religious communities that they lean on? recreational activities and playful things that they do, extended family members that are like non-blood related family that are treated like family. Like I have somebody that I referred to as Uncle Jim that I literally thought was my uncle until I was in college. And he literally is my dad's best friend. Yep. Thought he was my uncle. All right. So just take all those into account and remember that therapy is not just about the tools most of the time. It's really about the safe and trusting relationship that allows people to become unstuck from old patterns. So last, I'll show you just, kind of key elements that when you're integrating these culturally responsive approaches to treatment, you just think about doing things like intentionally completing a puzzle, that you want to do things like build emotion regulation skills, where you're skill building in the context of relationships with other people. Building in the context of relationships with other people. You can do the psychoeducation, but you want to partner with the BIPOC youth and families in understanding what the symptoms are in context while externalizing those symptoms from their identity. So don't make it about my depression or my anxiety. Externalize it, because that is tapping into the bias and the fears around vulnerabilities that you don't want to do. You want to be strength-based. You want to identify and apply those individual strengths that I kind of gave you some clues to look at, and make sure that that's the foundation for all interventions. And then you want to maximize the relationships, and know that all culturally responsive practices are really interpersonal. They're really collectivistic, and they foster engagement with other people. That's part of how it works. That's how it establishes and continues outside of the time that you are spending individually with a person. So if the way that I think about it is, if we intentionally know ourselves and if we keep in awareness the full identities of our BIPOC youth in particular, we will serve them appropriately, and they will not have to endure, that they actually will thrive. So I have a few references here. So these are several books that remain part of my repertoire that I lean on pretty often, that give great advice and good cultural literacy suggestions, so that you can kind of learn about other cultural groups and ways to kind of build your knowledge and expertise as a foundation for learning about others. And then one I did not fit on here is Cultural Humility by Joshua Hook and Davis. It's published by APA. So, and others, if there are other resources that you are looking for in particular, feel free to email, and then I'm happy to share. All right, so time for questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Janine. And before diving in, just really quickly, I want to echo some of the things that were in the chat that I also feel. So people were really engaged and responsive about the clear explanation you gave, not only about what implicit bias is, but actionable ways to address it. There were a few comments about that. Lots and lots of love for the context and value difference table, which I was also like, print screen. And then the focus on within group variation, which acknowledges and honors the full humanity of minoritized youth and people writ large. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kathy Corbin. I am a postdoc at the Smart Center. And I'm going to let my colleague introduce herself and ask the first question.
Thanks,
Hello,
Kathy.
everyone. And thank you again, Janine, so much for this wonderful presentation. Super informative. I learned a lot from it too. And I hope you all did as well. One of the first questions we got here is, how do we implement and model these important strategies and approaches, given that several states are leaning on educators to limit their abilities to discuss and address racial history and racism, and et cetera?
I love that question. Okay, so I feel like if you go to the GEMIS and you look at the ways the questions are worded, you can ask any of them. It is part of if you look at the way that biased legislation was written, that actually was dismantled, that's now being revised at the state level, it is about imposing knowledge around, what is it called? Critical race theory is what they're trying to use. I did not say anything in the GMS about critical race theory. I ask a person about their beliefs and about themselves and about their identity. There's nothing wrong with doing that. So all of those, and nobody can tell you you can't, that it's not against the law, it's not unethical. And so if you kind of go through those questions and think about how you do your practices when you're trying to learn about another person, this is no different. You're just asking about a part of themselves and their identity that you're not imposed. It's almost like religion. Like you can ask about religion, about what a person's beliefs are, as long as you're not imposing yours on them when you're in a school setting. So I don't see any problem with it.
Awesome, thank you for that. Another question we had was that so much of what you talked about implicated different forms of bias. And one audience member was wondering what implications this holds specifically for clinical supervision. So a lot of what you talked about today was like you are out in the world and practicing, but for those who might be supervising trainees or things like that, what suggestions do you have for those folks?
Yeah, so that's actually the role that I'm in now is that I'm actually not in practice anymore. And so when doing supervision, I'm actually asking my students to do the same thing. So I'm giving the advice of, what do you know about that person's culture? What have you asked? Or when I'm watching sessions, I'll do things like that where I'll say, well, I noticed that they kind of gave a little bit of a clue about this experience that they were having. And I'm wondering if they were actually telling you about a racialized experience, or if they were telling you about their socioeconomic situation. Maybe let's circle back and explore that. And so as supervisors, we can do the same thing. It's guiding people in how to get at these concepts to dig deeper and connect at a deeper level in the same ways that we would if we were doing it ourselves.
Awesome. I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Respectful of people's time. No, but people actually sent in questions and we kept marking them answered live. You did a great job of like anticipating people's questions. So it's not like we have a ton looming. Natalie, did you want to do the evaluation slide? And Janine, if you wouldn't mind pulling that up on full screen.
Yeah, no problem. Okay.
All right. Thank you again, Janine, and everyone else who participated today's webinar. If you guys could please fill out the session evaluation, the link is in the chat. It's required by our funders to continue to be able to support everyone with these webinars and sessions with people like Janine. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's session.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.